Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. It happened to me. It was the fall of 2002, and Baton Rouge was living under a kind of fear I've never felt before or since. The city was on edge because of one man, the Baton Rouge serial killer. Every news broadcast talked about him. Every conversation eventually drifted back to him. Women were warned not to jog alone, not to shop alone at night, not to park near wooded areas or lakes. The FBI was involved. Profiles were circulating. Rumors spread faster than facts. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It felt personal, like the city itself was holding its breath. One night, my girlfriend called me. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was panicked, barely able to get the words out. She told me she had just left Walmart and that a white pickup truck was following her. Not just casually, behind her in traffic, but following her, matching every turn, staying close. At the time, the FBI had publicly stated that the killer might be driving a white pickup truck. That detail had burned itself into everyone's mind. So when she said those words, my stomach dropped. She told me she had already tried to lose him. She had driven in circles. She had gone into cul-de-sacs and back out again. She had taken turns that made no sense unless you were trying to see if someone was tailing you. The truck stayed with her every time. She was crying. She was terrified. And I could hear it in her voice that this wasn't just nerves. She knew deep down that something was very wrong. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my best friend and we jumped into his car and tore across town. I don't remember how fast we were going, only that every red light felt like it was trying to kill us. My phone stayed glued to my ear as I tried to keep her calm, telling her to keep driving, not to pull over, not to go home yet. A few minutes later, we caught up. We were exiting on Dalrymple when I saw her car ahead of us. She drove right past me, and right behind her, close enough that there was no doubt anymore, was the white pickup truck. Seeing it with my own eyes made the situation suddenly real in a way it hadn't been over the phone. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This was happening. She was house-sitting for a wealthy relative who lived nearby in a quiet, upscale neighborhood close to the LSU lakes. I called her and told her we were behind the truck now, that she should head straight there. She pulled into the driveway, I shaking so badly she could barely park. The truck didn't pull in behind her. It stopped one house earlier. It parked right on the edge of the LSU lakes. That detail still chills me. We pulled in behind her car. She jumped out, completely hysterical, crying, barely able to stand. I wrapped my arms around her and tried to ground her, telling her it was probably nothing, probably some idiot following the wrong car. LSU's campus was right there, after all. Students everywhere, people driving around at all hours. I wanted to believe that explanation, as much as she did. My roommate stood on the porch, watching everything. My best friend stayed close. And I did the one thing that, looking back, could have gone very badly. I walked toward the truck. As I got closer, I could see the driver inside. He wouldn't look directly at me. His face stayed angled away, eyes darting sideways. I remember feeling a strange mix of fear and relief at the same time, because when I got close enough to see him clearly, I realized he was an African-American man. At that time, the FBI profile said the killer was white. That fact washed over me like a wave of relief. I immediately told myself we had been wrong. That fear had filled in the blanks, that this was just a misunderstanding fueled by a terrified city and a frightened woman driving alone at night. I told him calmly that he had scared my girlfriend. I explained that she thought she was being followed and that he had likely just been behind the wrong car leaving Walmart. He didn't respond much. He gave me a brief side-eyed glance. No apology, no explanation, just a look that I couldn't quite read. Then he drove off. We stood there for a long time after that, watching his taillights disappear. My girlfriend eventually calmed down enough to go inside. I stayed with her for a while, making sure she was okay. Eventually, we all convinced ourselves that it had been a coincidence. A misunderstanding amplified by fear and tension, and a city already primed to expect the worst. Life went on. I never saw that man again in person. But the following year, everything came rushing back. I opened a newspaper and saw his face staring back at me from the front page. It was everywhere. Television, print, online. The arrest that finally ended Baton Rouge's nightmare. DNA evidence had identified the killer. His name was Derek Todd Lee. The realization hit me like a physical blow. That was him. The man in the white pickup truck. The man parked by the LSU lakes. The man who wouldn't look me in the eye. The man I had stood a few feet away from, talking to him like he was just another guy who'd made a mistake. I replayed that night over and over in my head. Every detail took on a new weight. The way he followed her so persistently. The way he stopped just short of her driveway. The way he parked by the water. The way he avoided eye contact. The way he drove off without a word. The FBI profile had been wrong, and because of that, I had let my guard down. The thought that still haunts me the most is how close it all came. How easily that night could have ended differently. If we hadn't gotten there when we did. If she had pulled over. If she had gone somewhere isolated instead of a well-lit neighborhood. If he had decided to do something before we arrived. I think about how casually I approached that truck. How confident I felt once I thought the profile didn't match. How unaware I was that I was standing face to face with a man who had already taken lives and would have taken more if he hadn't been caught. People talk about serial killers like they're monsters you can spot from a mile away. Like there's something obvious about them, something visibly wrong. That night taught me how false that idea is. Sometimes they're just a man in a truck, parked on a quiet street, blending into the background of a terrified city. I had a run-in with Derek Todd Lee, and I didn't know it until it was far too late. This story didn't happen to me directly, but it was told to me by someone I trust deeply, and it has stayed with me in a way very few things ever have. Not because it was loud or violent or shocking in the usual sense, but because of how calm and deliberate everything was. There was no panic, no hysteria, no dramatic moment where someone screamed or ran. Instead, there was a slow, steady realization, followed by a quiet decision to walk away from a place that had stopped feeling safe. It began with a couple who, by all accounts, were genuinely good people, kind, patient, thoughtful, the type of parents who listened when their child spoke, who didn't dismiss fears as imagination or brushed things off as just a phase. They had a young son, still small enough that his world revolved around bedtime routines, familiar toys, and the comfort of knowing his parents were nearby. Then he started hearing voices. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Kids say strange things sometimes. He told his parents that someone was talking in his room, whispering. When they asked what the voices were saying, he couldn't explain clearly. It was vague, disconnected. His parents did what most responsible parents would do. They checked the obvious possibilities. Pipes in the walls, wind brushing against the house, the normal noises older homes make at night. They reassured him, stayed with him until he fell asleep, and assumed it would pass. It didn't. Night after night, the boy grew more distressed. He became afraid of bedtime. He didn't want to be left alone in his room. He would wake up crying, shaking, insisting the voices had come back. His sleep deteriorated. His behavior changed. He became anxious in a way that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a child inventing stories or seeking attention. He was genuinely frightened. His parents took it seriously. They went the responsible route first. Doctors, specialists, evaluations. They wanted to rule out anything medical or psychological. Hearing problems, anxiety disorders, early signs of hallucinations. Everything came back normal. His development was fine. His mental health showed no red flags. There was nothing that explained what he was describing. So they turned their attention back to the house. They hired professionals. Plumbers to check the pipes. Electricians to inspect wiring and outlets. Anyone who might be able to explain strange sounds traveling through walls. The first electrician went through the house carefully. He checked circuits, junction boxes, fixtures. He found nothing unusual. He suggested that sound can sometimes travel in strange ways, especially in older homes, but he couldn't identify a clear source. The voices continued. As the months passed, exhaustion settled over the household. Sleep was fragmented. Stress built quietly. At some point, they had another child. Not just because of the situation, of course, but they hoped it might help, that their son wouldn't feel so alone, that having another presence in the house might change whatever dynamic was at play. For a short while, things seemed better. Then the baby started having trouble sleeping too. Long nights, constant crying. Everyone was exhausted. One night, when things were especially bad, the father decided to take the baby monitor and sleep in his older son's room so his wife could get a few hours of uninterrupted rest. He didn't expect anything unusual. He had spent plenty of nights in that room before, sitting beside the bed, calming his son's fears. He lay down, tired, focused on sleep, and then he heard it. Whispering, low, indistinct, but unmistakable. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was clearly more than one voice. They overlapped slightly, close together, coming from somewhere near the wall and the window. Not outside, not clearly inside the room either. Somewhere in between. He sat up. He listened. The voices didn't stop. They didn't sound like pipes knocking or wind pushing through gaps. There was rhythm to them, cadence, the unmistakable texture of human whispering. The kind of sound your brain recognizes immediately, even when you don't want to. He didn't wake his son. He stayed still, listening, trying to find a rational explanation, trying to convince himself there had to be one. But the longer he listened, the more certain he became that what his child had been describing all along was real. The next morning, they called another electrician. This is where my friend enters the story. He was the second electrician brought in after the first one found nothing. He went in skeptical, as any professional would. He'd heard plenty of stories about strange noises that ended up being mundane. He wasn't dismissive, but he wasn't expecting anything extraordinary either. By the time he arrived, the room had already been completely emptied. No bed, no toys, no furniture, no decorations, just bare walls, a window, and an uneasy silence. At first. Then they stood in a specific spot, between the window and the adjoining wall, and they heard it, whispering, faint but clear enough that there was no mistaking it. It wasn't coming from the ceiling or the floor. It wasn't traveling through vents. It felt localized, concentrated in that one section of the room. My friend did what he knew how to do. He shut off the main power to the entire house. Not just the room, everything, every circuit. Total electrical silence. The voices continued. He checked for the obvious next. He accessed the roof cavity. He inspected wall spaces where possible. He used cameras to look into voids that weren't easily reachable. He checked for hidden speakers, rogue wiring, anything that could transmit sound. There was nothing. No devices, no animals. No structural explanation that made sense. And still, standing in that same place, you could hear whispering. At that point, my friend suggested the next logical step, removing the wall. Not dramatically, not urgently, just matter of fact. If the sound was coming from inside the wall, opening it up was the only way to know for sure what was there. The parents declined. They didn't argue. They didn't panic. They didn't demand more tests or another opinion. They simply said they were leaving. They had already decided. The cost of tearing open walls, of continuing to search for explanations, of subjecting their children to more nights of fear, wasn't worth it. Whatever was happening in that house, whether it could be explained or not, had crossed the line. They packed up and moved out. They didn't wait to sell. They didn't try to fix the problem. They chose uncertainty somewhere else over certainty in a place that no longer felt safe. My friend finished what he could, wrote his report, and walked away. When he told me the story later, he didn't embellish it. He didn't frame it as something supernatural. He told it plainly, professionally, but there was something in his voice that stuck with me, a hesitation, a quiet discomfort. He was someone who dealt in wires, circuits, measurable things. This wasn't that. What unsettles me most isn't the idea of voices in the walls. It's the process. Every rational step was taken. Medical causes ruled out. Environmental explanations investigated. Power cut, walls checked, professionals involved, nothing ignored, nothing rushed. And still the voices were there. There was no final reveal. No explanation that tied everything together. Just a family deciding that sometimes the safest choice is to stop asking questions and leave. I think about that child often, about how terrifying it must have been to hear something no one else believed at first, about the relief he must have felt when his father finally heard it too. And I think about how thin the line is between what we understand and what we don't. Some houses are just houses, and some, for reasons we may never fully grasp, are not. In the place I used to live, there were a couple of things that happened that never really left me. They weren't things I witnessed directly, but they were close enough, familiar enough, that they settled into my mind and stayed there. Even now, years later, when I think about that neighborhood, those are the moments that surface first. One of them happened in the very apartment building where I lived. It was the middle of the night, sometime around 2 in the morning. Most of the building was asleep. Later on, we learned that a man who lived there, a police officer, had gotten into a vicious fight with his wife. The kind of fight where voices echo through walls and doors slam hard enough to shake picture frames. I didn't hear it myself that night, which I'm grateful for, but some of the neighbors did. They said it went on for a long time, rising and falling, the sound of a marriage tearing itself apart behind closed doors. At some point during the argument, the man grabbed their young son. The kid was only 3 or 4 years old. He bundled him into the car and drove him across town to his brother's place. The uncle was confused and half asleep when they arrived. But when the man explained that things were bad between him and his wife, the uncle didn't question it. He took the boy in, assuming that by morning things would cool down and the parents would sort it out like adults. The man then went back to the apartment. Whatever happened after that was final. More yelling, more fighting, and then gunshots. He shot his wife, then he shot himself. By the time anyone fully understood what had happened, it was already over. Police cars, ambulances, flashing lights in the dark. The kind of scene you see on the news and never expect to happen in the building where you sleep. I was lucky enough to sleep through it, but the neighbors closest to that apartment weren't. They heard everything. The arguments, the shots, the silence afterward. Some of them moved out not long after. Others stayed. But they were never quite the same. You could see it in their faces, in how quiet they became, in how they avoided eye contact in the hallway. What stuck with me the most was the son. That little boy had been spared the worst of it by pure chance. If his father hadn't driven him away in the middle of the night, he would have been there. He would have heard it. He might have seen it. Instead, he slept on his uncle's couch, completely unaware that his life had just split into a before and an after that could never be stitched back together. The days that followed were strange in a way that's hard to describe, unless you've lived through something similar. The building was still standing. People still went to work, took out the trash, waited for the elevator. On the surface, everything looked the same. But the atmosphere had shifted. It felt heavier. Conversations were quieter. Doors closed more gently, or sometimes more carefully, as if everyone was suddenly aware of how thin the walls really were. There were rumors, of course, people trying to make sense of it. Some said the marriage had been troubled for years. Others claimed they'd heard shouting before, late at night, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. A few people expressed anger. They're asking why someone who carried a gun for a living hadn't gotten help sooner. Others focused on the wife, on what she must have endured in that relationship. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really had answers. What no one argued about was the child. Every conversation eventually circled back to him, to where he was now, to how he would grow up, to whether he would remember any of it. People speculated about therapy, about foster care, about whether his uncle would be able to give him a stable life. Some hoped he was young enough that it wouldn't stay with him. Others quietly doubted that. Trauma doesn't always need clear memories to leave a mark. Sometimes, when I walked past that apartment door, I found myself slowing down without meaning to. The door looked the same as every other door in the hallway. Same color, same handle, and same faint scuff marks near the bottom. But knowing what had happened behind it changed everything. It felt wrong to stand there for too long, like lingering might somehow disturb something that was already settled. Eventually, new people moved in. Life went on, the way it always does, but that story became part of the building's identity, even if it was never spoken out loud again. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the way some neighbors would stiffen if they heard raised voices through the walls, even when it was just a TV or an argument that went nowhere. The second event happened just a block away, at a friend's apartment building. That building had a very distinct layout. The ground floor was covered in bright white tiles, almost glossy. To get anywhere, whether you were leaving the building or heading to another apartment, you had to pass through a large common area. From that space, you could look up and see all the balconies stacked above, floor after floor, like a vertical grid. It was open, airy, and usually filled with the sound of footsteps and voices echoing softly off the tile. It was the kind of place that felt communal. People crossed paths there all the time. Neighbors nodded at each other, exchanged quick greetings, sometimes stopped to talk. Kids ran through it. People waited there for rides. It was meant to be a neutral space, a shared part of daily life. One night, a woman who lived there jumped from the top of the building. There was no warning for most people, no announcement, no build-up that anyone noticed. Just a scream that cut through the air, sharp and sudden, followed by a sound that didn't quite make sense at first. A sound that was too loud, too final, too wrong to be anything else. People rushed out of their apartments. Some froze where they stood. Others ran forward without really knowing why. Someone screamed again. Someone else started crying. Phones came out. Sirens followed not long after. Later it came out that the woman had been suffering from severe depression. Friends talked about how she'd been struggling, how she'd seemed distant, how she'd tried to hide it, or maybe how they hadn't known what to look for. Those conversations always come later, once the shock settles enough for people to speak. But at the time, none of that mattered. What mattered was what people saw when they looked down. The next day, it was all over the local news. A tragic headline, a short article, a few quotes from police. The kind of story that exists for one news cycle before being replaced by the next tragedy. For people who didn't live there, it was just another sad thing that happened somewhere else. For the people who did live there, it was impossible to forget. My friend lived in that building. When she first told me about it, she didn't give details. She didn't dramatize it. She just looked different, like something in her had dimmed. After a long pause, she said, almost under her breath, "Red." There was red splattered everywhere. She didn't say anything else. That sentence alone was enough to make my stomach drop. Later, when I visited her, she asked if I wanted to see something. I didn't really know what she meant until we walked down into the common area. The space looked clean at first glance. Too clean. Like someone had put a lot of effort into making it look normal again. She pointed to the floor. The white tiles weren't truly white anymore. There were faint stains, uneven and patchy, darker than the rest. They weren't obvious unless you knew to look for them. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. They didn't look like dirt or wear. They looked like something had soaked in and refused to leave. She said, "Yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking it is." They cleaned it as well as they could, but some stains never came off. Standing there, I felt a strange mix of emotions, horror, sadness, and a kind of quiet anger that I didn't fully understand. This wasn't a crime scene hidden behind tape or walls. This was a space people had to walk through every day, a place where life continued, even though something unimaginably final had happened there. I couldn't help but imagine the moment itself, the fall, the suddenness, the way gravity takes over without mercy, the sound echoing through that open space, the way people must have screamed, frozen, run, or turned away. It felt wrong to stand there too long, but it also felt wrong to walk away too quickly. After that, my friend told me she avoided the common area whenever she could. She took different routes. She timed her comings and goings to avoid passing through when others were around. She said that sometimes late at night, the building felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Eventually, she moved out. She never said outright that the incident was the reason, but it didn't need to be said. Some places become unbearable once you associate them with certain memories. No amount of cleaning or repainting can undo that. Those two events changed how I saw that neighborhood. Before, it had just been a place, buildings, streets, sidewalks, people living their lives side by side, mostly unaware of each other. Afterward, it felt different, like the ground itself held stories that didn't want to be forgotten. What stayed with me wasn't just the violence or the deaths. It was the aftermath. The way life went on around those moments. The way people adapted, coped, or quietly broke under the weight of what they had witnessed or heard. The neighbors who couldn't unhear the gunshots. The ones who lay awake at night, replaying sounds they wished they could erase. The child who would grow up without parents, carrying a loss he never chose. The tiles that never quite returned to white, no matter how much effort went into cleaning them. It taught me something about how fragile normalcy really is. We move through spaces assuming they're neutral, safe, ordinary. But sometimes, just beneath that surface, there are layers of grief, violence, and despair that don't announce themselves. They exist quietly, embedded in walls, floors, and memories. Some places carry what happened there, whether you acknowledge it or not, and sometimes, even when everything looks clean and quiet again, you can still feel it. Not as fear exactly, but as a subtle unease, a sense that something fractured there once and the crack never fully closed. That neighborhood is far behind me now. I don't walk those hallways or cross those tiled floors anymore. But when I think about it, those stories rise to the surface first. Not the good days, not the ordinary moments, the ones that revealed how quickly lives can unravel and how close we can be to tragedy without ever realizing it. They're reminders I didn't ask for, but they stayed with me anyway, and I don't think they ever really leave. I had a friend who once told me a story that has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't dramatic in the way people usually expect scary stories to be. There was no violence, no screaming, no moment where everything exploded into chaos. That's part of what made it so disturbing. It was quiet, personal, unfinished. The kind of story that doesn't end when you stop talking about it, but instead follows you into the quiet moments of your own life. He was a teenager when it happened. His mom needed to go stay at her mother's house for a few days. The house had been in the family for generations, and it was old in a way that felt deeper than just age. Not charming old, not nostalgic old. It was heavy with time. The floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. The hallways were narrow and seemed to swallow sound. Doors never quite closed the way they should. Even during the day, the light didn't fully reach the corners of the rooms, as if the house preferred shadows. His mom didn't want to go alone. She didn't explain it clearly, and she didn't need to. She just said she didn't feel right about being there by herself. There was hesitation in her voice, the kind that comes from intuition rather than logic. So my friend went with her. He didn't love the idea, but he agreed. He figured it would be a few boring days, maybe a little uncomfortable, but nothing serious. They arrived in the afternoon. They carried their bags inside and tried to make the place feel normal again. His grandmother wasn't there at the time, which made the house feel strange. Not abandoned exactly, just empty in a way that felt intentional. Like the house was aware people had returned but hadn't decided how it felt about it. They made dinner. They watched television. They talked about small, ordinary things. Everything felt forced but calm. Eventually, they got ready for bed. There weren't enough proper bedrooms, so his mom took one of the back rooms, and my friend slept on the couch in the living room. He didn't mind that part. In fact, he preferred it. The living room felt more open, more central. He felt less trapped there than he would have in one of the narrow bedrooms. When the lights were turned off, the house changed. It settled into itself. Pops and creaks echoed softly through the walls. Something ticked faintly somewhere, mechanical and slow. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. My friend lay on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, listening. He wasn't scared. Exactly. But he was alert. Like some part of him knew this was a place where you didn't fully relax. At some point in the night, he heard footsteps. They came from the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not rushed, not heavy, just steady steps moving along the old floorboards. His first thought was that it was his mom getting up to use the bathroom. The hallway connected her bedroom to the bathroom and passed right by the living room. That explanation made sense. It was comforting, even. He didn't want her to know he was still awake. It felt childish but instinctive. So he closed his eyes and stayed perfectly still, breathing evenly, pretending to be asleep. The footsteps kept coming. Each step grew clearer as they got closer. He could hear the faint shift of weight, the subtle sound of someone moving through the house. Everything about it felt normal, familiar, almost reassuring. Until the footsteps stopped. They stopped right beside the couch. He stayed frozen, eyes shut tight, body rigid. He waited for the sound of her turning toward the bathroom, or maybe a soft whisper, or the sound of footsteps continuing down the hall. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence. Then he felt it. Breath. Warm breath brushed across his forehead. It was close enough that he could feel the air move against his skin. Close enough that whoever it was had to be leaning over him. His mind scrambled for explanations. His first thought was that his mom was checking on him. Maybe about to give him a goodnight kiss, the way she used to when he was younger. But something was wrong. The breath lingered. Too long. There was no familiar scent. No rustle of clothes. No quiet voice saying his name. Just the steady presence of someone breathing inches from his face. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to open his eyes, to jump up. But something deeper told him not to. He was suddenly terrified of what he might see if he did. So he stayed still. After what felt like forever, the breath stopped. He felt the presence straighten up. The weight shifted slightly. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from the couch and back down the hallway. He stayed exactly where he was, eyes still closed, body locked in place. Long after the sound faded, he didn't move. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't call out to his mom. He just lay there, replaying the moment over and over in his head. Morning eventually came. Sunlight filled the living room. The house looked harmless in the daylight, just old, just quiet. The fear from the night before felt unreal in the brightness, like a nightmare that didn't quite make sense anymore. At breakfast, he asked his mom, as casually as he could, why she had checked on him during the night. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, confused. She told him she hadn't left her room. She said she'd had a bad feeling the moment they arrived. Something about the house made her uneasy, especially at night. She admitted she had locked her bedroom door and stayed in bed, too afraid to even get up to use the bathroom. She hadn't slept much either. When he told her what he had experienced, the color drained from her face. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell him he imagined it. She didn't try to explain it away. She just listened. Then she told him they wouldn't talk about it anymore. They stayed for the rest of the visit, but everything felt different. They kept lights on at night. They avoided certain rooms. They moved through the house quickly, as if not wanting to linger. Neither of them slept well. A few months later, his grandmother passed away. They had to return to the house to pack up her belongings. This time, it wasn't a temporary visit. The house was being closed for good. During the day, it was manageable, sad but normal. They sorted through old furniture, family photos, boxes filled with forgotten things. The house felt empty, but calm, like it was finally letting go. As soon as the sun began to set, everything shifted. The air grew heavier. Shadows stretched too long across the walls. The sounds seemed sharper, louder. Even his mom admitted she felt it immediately, like something had changed the moment daylight faded. They didn't wait to see if the feeling would pass. That night, they packed up what they could and went to stay in a motel. Neither of them wanted to sleep in that house again. Not after what had happened. Not after the way it felt when the light disappeared. My friend told me that sometimes he still thinks about that night on the couch, about how close whatever it was came to him, about how real it felt, about the warmth of breath on his skin. He wonders what he would have seen if he had opened his eyes. And that question, unanswered and unanswerable, is what scares him the most. Because some things don't need to hurt you physically to leave a mark. Some things just need to stand close enough for you to feel them breathing. In the 1840s, westward expansion was fueled by hope. Families packed up their lives and headed toward California, believing they were chasing something better. Land was advertised as fertile and plentiful. Opportunity felt limitless. The idea of starting fresh, of building something new far away from crowded cities and limited prospects, pulled thousands of people across the continent. On paper, it sounded like a promise. In reality, it was a gamble with lives at stake. The Donner Party was made up of families, couples, children, and individuals who believed that promise. They weren't reckless thrill seekers. They were people trying to improve their circumstances, just like countless others at the time. Many had saved for years, sold what little they had, and placed all their faith in the journey west. They traveled by wagon, moving slowly across vast distances, trusting maps that were often incomplete or flat out wrong. The danger of that journey is hard to fully grasp from a modern perspective. Today, we cross the same terrain in hours, protected by roads, weather forecasts, and rescue services. Back then, travelers faced mountains, deserts, rivers, and weather patterns they barely understood. Every mile came with risk. Still, most groups made it through by sticking to known routes and timing their travel carefully. The Donner Party didn't. They made a series of decisions that on their own might not have been fatal. But together, they created a perfect storm. One of the most devastating choices was taking an untested shortcut that promised to save time. It didn't. Instead, it slowed them down drastically. Wagons broke. Terrain was rougher than expected. Progress became painfully slow. Days turned into weeks, and weeks slipped away as winter crept closer. That delay sealed their fate. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, winter had already begun to assert itself. Snow came early and came hard. What might have been a manageable crossing in better conditions became impossible. The snow piled up relentlessly, burying trails, blocking passes, and trapping the group in place. Wagons couldn't move. Animals collapsed from exhaustion and hunger. The mountains became walls instead of landmarks. They were completely cut off. There was no path forward and no realistic way to turn back. Supplies dwindled faster than anyone had prepared for. Food that was meant to last weeks disappeared in days. At first, they tried to be careful. They rationed. They hunted when they could. They stretched what little they had as far as possible. They boiled hides, chewed leather, and ate anything remotely edible. But winter didn't end. Snow kept falling. Temperatures dropped. Hunger gnawed at everyone constantly. Children cried from starvation. Adults grew thinner and weaker, watching their families suffer and knowing there was no rescue coming anytime soon. Every day became a calculation. Who eats today? Who can go without? Who might survive if someone else doesn't? Eventually, people began to die. Illness, exposure, and starvation claimed them one by one. Death wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow and inevitable. Bodies weakened. Spirits broke. Hope faded. And for the people still alive, death brought with it a terrifying question they never imagined they would face. What do you do when the only thing left between you and death is a line you swore you would never cross? When the living realized that survival might require using the bodies of those who had already died, some of them made a choice that history would never let them forget. They resorted to cannibalism. Not out of cruelty, not out of madness, not because they wanted to, but because hunger leaves no room for dignity or moral comfort. It reduces existence to its most basic form: eat or die. That is what makes the Donner Party's story so disturbing. These were not monsters hiding in the wilderness. They were parents trying to keep their children alive. They were siblings watching each other waste away. They were neighbors who had shared meals and laughter before the journey began. Starvation stripped away everything else and left only survival. Some people refused and died. Others crossed that line and lived. There is no clean way to judge either choice. History often tries to separate heroes from villains, but this story resists that. It exists in a gray space that is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to imagine ourselves there. What would you do if your child was starving in front of you? What would you do if you knew that help was not coming? What would you do if tomorrow looked exactly like today, only colder and more hopeless? Only a small number of the Donner Party survived the winter. When rescue efforts finally reached the camps, what they found shocked the nation. The details were hard to speak about, harder to print, and impossible to forget. The idea that Americans, a pioneers chasing opportunity, had been driven to cannibalism shattered romantic ideas about the frontier. The Donner Party became a symbol of the darkest side of westward expansion. Their story cut through the myth of endless opportunity and revealed the brutal reality beneath it. The American frontier wasn't just courage and progress. It was suffering, isolation, miscalculation, and death. Over the years, the story has been retold many times. Books, documentaries, lectures, and films have tried to capture what happened. One depiction that left a lasting impression on me was the movie 17 Miracles. The film addresses the Donner Party early on, and while it doesn't dwell on every detail, the imagery is haunting. Seeing the snow, the isolation, and the exhaustion on people's faces makes it harder to keep emotional distance. Visualizing it changes everything. The endless white, the silence, the way snow absorbs sound until the world feels deadened and unreal. The realization that winter isn't ending, that help isn't coming, and that survival will demand something unthinkable. Seeing it depicted makes it easier to understand how hope slowly eroded into despair. What makes the Donner Party especially tragic is how much of it might have been avoided. A different route, better timing, a refusal to trust an unproven shortcut. Even a small change could have altered the outcome. Instead, a chain of choices led them straight into disaster. It's tempting to judge them from the comfort of the present, to say they should have known better, to say they made foolish decisions. But hindsight is merciless and unfair. They were working with limited information, false promises, and pressure to keep moving. Many other groups took risks and survived. This one didn't. That's what makes it frightening. The difference between survival and catastrophe wasn't courage or morality. It was timing, geography, and luck. When I think about the Donner Party now, what stays with me most is the quietness of their suffering. Snow muffles sound. Mountains isolate. People died slowly in frozen cabins while the rest of the world continued on, unaware. Somewhere else, life went on as usual. Children were born, crops were harvested, cities grew. And up in the mountains, people were fading away, one by one. There's something deeply unsettling about that disconnect. The Donner Party forces us to confront how thin the veneer of civilization really is, how quickly rules, ethics, and social structures can collapse when basic needs aren't met. Hunger and cold don't negotiate. They don't care who you are or what you believe. They strip life down to instinct. It's also a reminder that history isn't always heroic. Some chapters don't fit neatly into narratives of bravery and triumph. Some are warnings rather than celebrations. They exist to remind us of our limits, our vulnerability, and the cost of ignoring nature and chance. Every time I think about the Donner Party, I imagine the silence, the waiting, the moment when people realized spring wasn't coming soon enough, the knowledge that the world they knew was slipping away, replaced by something raw and brutal. It's not a story you tell for entertainment. It's a story you sit with, one that challenges comfort and certainty, one that makes you uneasy, not because it's shocking, but because it's human. Once you truly understand it, it doesn't fade. It becomes part of how you think about survival, history, and the fragile line between morality and necessity. And maybe that's why it still matters. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. This is one of those stories that doesn't loosen its grip once you hear it. It stays with you. Not because it's loud or graphic, but because of how quiet and intentional it was. The details are simple, almost minimal. And that simplicity is what makes the weight of it so hard to shake. The more time passes, the heavier it feels, like your mind keeps circling back to it, trying to make sense of something that never fully will. I went to school with her. At the time, she was a freshman at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Like most first-year students, she was new to campus, new to independence, and surrounded by people who were all trying to figure themselves out at the same time. College has a strange way of flattening everyone into the same category at first. You're all just students. Faces blur together. Everyone is stressed, excited, overwhelmed, hopeful, exhausted, and pretending to have things under control. On the surface, she didn't stand out in any obvious way. She wasn't someone people whispered about or avoided. She wasn't known for dramatic behavior or public breakdowns. If you passed her on campus, you would have seen someone who looked like she belonged there. Someone who blended in. Someone who looked like they were doing what thousands of other students were doing every day. That's the part that still messes with me. How normal everything seemed from the outside. People eventually learned that she hated her mother. Not in the casual, half-joking way people talk about their parents when they're young and frustrated. Not the kind of anger that comes and goes with arguments about rules or expectations. This was something much deeper, something that had been building for a long time, something unresolved, heavy, and consuming. I don't know all the details of their relationship. Very few people did, and even fewer probably ever will. Family dynamics are complicated in ways outsiders can't fully see. There are histories, patterns, wounds, and moments that don't show up in casual conversation. Whatever existed between them wasn't new. It didn't start in college. It was something that had been carried forward year after year, growing heavier instead of lighter. At some point, she decided to invite her mother to campus. She asked her to come to her dorm room so they could go out to lunch together. On its own, that doesn't sound alarming. In fact, it sounds hopeful. For a parent who knows their relationship with their child has been strained, that invitation would feel enormous. It would feel like progress, like a door opening after a long period of distance and pain. I try to imagine what that must have felt like for her mother, getting that invitation, reading the message, wondering what it meant. Maybe feeling nervous, but also relieved. Maybe thinking this was a chance to reconnect, to talk, to understand each other better. Maybe believing that college had softened something, that time and space had helped. To that mother, it probably felt like a turning point. So she came. She traveled to campus, likely feeling out of place among students young enough to be her child's peers. Walking across campus can feel intimidating if you don't belong there, especially as a parent. Everywhere you look, there's movement, noise, laughter, people going somewhere with purpose. She would have been surrounded by life, energy, and possibility. She made her way to the dorm. She walked down the hallway, past closed doors, bulletin boards, muffled music, voices echoing from other rooms, ordinary sounds, ordinary sights. Nothing that would prepare her for what was about to happen. When she reached her daughter's door, she found a note taped to it. "Mom, come in. I'm in the closet." On its own, that message wouldn't immediately suggest danger. Dorm rooms are small. Closets are sometimes used for privacy, for phone calls, for quiet. It might have seemed odd, but not frightening. Not something that would make a parent stop and call for help. She opened the door. She stepped inside her daughter's dorm room. Then she opened the closet. Her daughter had taken her own life. She had planned it so that her mother would be the one to find her. Not a roommate, not a friend, not campus staff. Her mother. That is the detail that makes the story unbearable. Suicide alone is devastating beyond words. It leaves behind shock, grief, confusion, guilt, and endless questions. But the deliberate choice to orchestrate the discovery adds another layer of trauma that's almost impossible to comprehend. This wasn't an accident of timing. It wasn't chance. It was intentional. Her mother didn't just lose her child. She was forced into being the one to find her. That image, that moment, is something no person should ever have to carry. It doesn't fade. It doesn't soften with time. It becomes a permanent imprint on the mind, a memory that returns without warning, a moment that rewrites everything that comes after it. On campus, the shock spread quickly. News like that doesn't stay contained. It moves through dorms, dining halls, classrooms. People whispered about it in low voices, unsure how to talk about something so heavy. Some people had known her personally. Some had spoken to her once or twice. Some had shared a class or lived on the same floor. Others knew her only as a name attached to a tragedy. Everyone reacted the same way at first. Disbelief, then horror. Then a kind of silence that settles over a place when no one knows what to say next. What haunted many of us wasn't just that she had died. It was how it happened. The planning, The note, the timing, the way hope had been used as part of the setup, the way a moment that should have been about reconciliation, or at least conversation, was turned into something catastrophic. It forced people to confront questions they weren't prepared to ask. How much pain does someone have to be in to do that? What kind of anger or despair leads to such a deliberate act? How little do we really know about the people we sit next to in class? How often does deep suffering hide behind normal behavior? College campuses are full of people carrying invisible battles: stress, depression, anxiety, family trauma. Everyone is trying to perform normalcy while navigating things they don't talk about. This story made that reality impossible to ignore. I still think about her mother. I think about her getting ready that day, choosing what to wear, driving to campus, maybe rehearsing conversation in her head, wondering what her daughter wanted to talk about, hoping this lunch would be a fresh start, or at least a step toward understanding each other better. I imagine her walking down that dorm hallway, surrounded by young people laughing, talking, living their lives, completely unaware that she was about to step into the worst moment of her own. That moment didn't just end a life. It shattered another one completely. No parent ever recovers from losing a child. But being the one to find them in a situation so deliberately arranged adds a level of trauma that's hard to even put into words. Grief becomes tangled with guilt, shock, and confusion. Questions have no answers. There is no way to rewrite that day. This wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a moment of sudden loss of control. It was planned, targeted, final. That doesn't make it easier to understand. If anything, it makes it harder. People often want to explain tragedies like this in neat terms: mental illness, family conflict, pressure. And while those things may be part of the picture, they don't fully explain the cruelty of the outcome. They don't make the pain easier to bear for the people left behind. Even years later, the story still feels unreal when I think about it, like something too cruel to actually happen. Something you'd expect to hear about far away, not in a place you walk through every day, not in a dorm room like any other, but it did happen. I was there. I went to school with her. This wasn't an urban legend or a rumor that grew over time. It was real, and it left a mark on the campus. People didn't talk about it openly for long, but it lingered, in the way conversations would stop when the topic came close, in the way people checked on each other a little more carefully for a while, in the way parents suddenly felt more present during visits. It was a reminder that sometimes the most horrifying stories aren't about strangers or distant history. Sometimes they happen in dorm rooms, on ordinary campuses, behind doors with handwritten notes taped to them. And sometimes the damage doesn't stop with the person who dies. It spreads outward. It changes families forever. It scars witnesses and loved ones. It leaves ripples that never fully disappear. I think about that often, about how pain doesn't exist in isolation, about how one act can alter countless lives in ways that can never be measured. And I think about how important it is to take suffering seriously, even when it isn't visible, even when someone looks fine, even when they seem like just another student blending into the crowd. Because sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that leave the deepest scars. And this is one of those stories. Years ago, when I was working as a 911 operator, I took a call that I still think about more often than I'd like. It wasn't loud or frantic at first. It didn't start with screaming or chaos. It started quietly, in a voice that sounded hollow, almost emptied out of emotion. The man on the line said very plainly, "I found a decapitated body. There's blood everywhere. Please help me." There was something about the way he said it that immediately set my nerves on edge. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't rambling. He sounded stunned, like someone whose mind had hit a wall and didn't know how to move forward. I'd taken plenty of calls from people who were panicking or exaggerating or even lying. This didn't feel like that. This felt like someone who genuinely believed they were standing in the middle of something unspeakable. I asked him where he was. He didn't know. That was the first major problem. This was years ago, before the systems we have now. No instant GPS location, no automatic address popping up on a screen. If a caller didn't know where they were, finding them could turn into a nightmare. I asked him to look around and tell me anything he could see. Street signs, store names, landmarks, anything at all. He struggled to answer. His thoughts seemed scattered, like he couldn't hold on to one detail long enough to describe it. He kept circling back to the same thing again and again. "There's blood everywhere. There's no head. I didn't do this. Please help me." I tried to slow him down, to ground him. I asked him to take a breath with me. I asked him to sit down if he could. I asked him to describe the space he was in. Oh, after a lot of repetition and gentle prompting, he said it was a big place. Empty. Echoing. He mentioned long hallways and broken glass. He said it felt like he was inside, but also like it went on forever. At that point, it was clear he was in shock. Severe shock. I've spoken to people who had just witnessed murders, fatal accidents, suicides. Trauma does strange things to the brain. People forget their own names. They forget where they are. They repeat themselves because their mind is stuck on one horrifying image. None of that by itself meant he wasn't telling the truth. But there were things that didn't quite add up. His phone number wasn't in our system. No name came up, no address history. I asked for his last name, and he couldn't give me one. I asked if he had ID on him. He didn't know. I asked if anyone else was there with him. He said no, then paused, then said maybe, then said he wasn't sure. Still, none of that made me dismiss him. People in crisis don't present neatly. My job wasn't to decide whether he was right or wrong. My job was to keep him safe and get help to him. Eventually, after a lot of careful questioning, we managed to piece together one solid clue. He said he thought he was in an abandoned mall. That was the first real foothold we'd gotten. There were only a handful of abandoned malls in the area, and fewer still that someone could realistically wander into. We dispatched officers to check all of them. I stayed on the line with him the entire time. I was afraid that if I hung up, he might panic, run, or collapse. He sounded like he was barely holding himself together. As we waited for officers to arrive, his fears seemed to grow. He said the body was close to him, then far away, then right in front of him again. He said the blood looked fresh, then said it was dark and dried. He said he could smell it, strong and metallic. He said it was on his hands, even though he insisted he hadn't touched anything. I asked him to look at his hands. There was a long pause. Then he started crying. He said his hands were clean, but he could still feel the blood on them. He kept rubbing them together, saying they felt sticky even though he could see they weren't. That was the moment when my stomach dropped. I'd heard that kind of confusion before, but never paired with something this vivid and this terrifying. When officers finally reached one of the abandoned malls, they found him almost immediately. He was sitting on the floor in the middle of a wide, empty corridor, knees pulled up to his chest, rocking slightly. There was no body, no blood, no signs of violence anywhere in the building. One of the officers recognized him. He was a missing person from a nearby jurisdiction. Everything clicked into place at once. This man hadn't stumbled onto a crime scene. He wasn't standing over a murdered body. He was in the middle of a severe hallucination. He had schizophrenia, and he had likely been off his medication for some time. Add dehydration, exhaustion, and isolation, and his mind had created a nightmare that felt completely real to him. In his reality, he was surrounded by blood. In his reality, there was a decapitated body. In his reality, he was terrified that he might be blamed for something he didn't understand. The fear in his voice hadn't been an act. It had been genuine. The officers approached him carefully. They didn't rush him or shout commands. They spoke calmly and gently. They didn't immediately tell him he was imagining things. They focused on reassuring him that he was safe and that help was there. They transported him straight to the hospital. He was severely dehydrated. He hadn't been taking his medication. He'd likely been wandering for days, confused and frightened, trying to make sense of a world that no longer matched what his brain was telling him. After being stabilized, he was reunited with his family, who had been desperately searching for him. He stayed inpatient for several days to recover physically and to get back on a proper medication regimen. The last I heard, the medication helped him a lot. See, but that call stayed with me, because for the entire time we were talking, that man was living inside a waking horror movie, one where he believed he'd found something unspeakable, one where he was completely alone in an abandoned place, convinced he was surrounded by death and blood. There was no escape from it because it was happening inside his own mind. Schizophrenia is one of those conditions people joke about or misunderstand, but moments like that show how cruel it can be. Hallucinations aren't always vague or dreamlike. Sometimes they are detailed, sensory, and overwhelming. Sometimes they hijack everything at once: sight, sound, smell, touch, and emotion. The brain doesn't suggest that something might be wrong. It insists that it is. That man wasn't dangerous. He wasn't violent. He wasn't a criminal. He was terrified and confused and completely vulnerable. I think about how easily that situation could have ended differently if he hadn't called. If he'd wandered into traffic, if someone had misunderstood his behavior and reacted with fear instead of care, if the officers hadn't recognized him. So many small things had to go right for that story to end without someone getting hurt. Calls like that change the way you see people in crisis. They remind you that not every horror involves a villain. Sometimes the horror is what someone's own mind is doing to them, and how real it feels while it's happening. That night didn't end in tragedy, and I'm grateful for that. But it left a deep mark on me. It made me acutely aware of how fragile our sense of reality really is, and how important patience and compassion are when someone is clearly not anchored to the same reality you are. And yeah, fuck schizophrenia. That poor guy didn't need judgment or suspicion. He needed help. And for once, he got it. It might not sound like the most sensational or dramatic story, but it's one that has stayed with me for years because of how ordinary it all felt, right up until it wasn't. There was no build-up that made you uneasy, no obvious warning signs that jumped out in the moment. Everything about it blended so easily into the background of daily life that, at the time, it barely registered as anything worth remembering. And that's exactly what makes it so unsettling now. At the time, I worked at a bank. It was a normal office environment. the kind where routines settle in quickly. You learn people's coffee habits, their schedules, the way they complain about Mondays and perk up on Fridays. You don't usually think of those places as settings for anything tragic. They feel structured and predictable, almost safe in their sameness. There was a guy I worked closely with, someone I interacted with almost every day. We shared tasks, sat in meetings together, and had the kind of casual rapport that builds when you spend a lot of time in the same space. There was also a woman in our department whose husband worked in a different area of the building. We all knew each other in that loose professional way that doesn't involve deep personal conversations, but still feels friendly. All three of us happened to be into golf. It wasn't a deep bond or anything meaningful. Just one of those surface-level interests that makes small talk easier. Golf came up in conversations about weekends, about vacations we dreamed of taking, about hobbies that helped us unwind after work. It was harmless, easy, and completely unremarkable. One day at work, my coworker and I were talking about a golf show that was coming to the Expo Mart that weekend. It was one of those large events with rows of booths, new equipment on display, demonstrations, and giveaways. The kind of thing that appeals to people who enjoy the sport, even if they're not serious players. We were talking about it casually, not even sure yet if we were actually going to go. The woman overheard us and mentioned that her husband was interested too. She suggested that the three of us go together. It didn't feel awkward or forced. My coworker had met her husband socially once or twice before at work events, so there was already a loose familiarity there. It felt like a natural extension of an office conversation, the kind of plan people make all the time without much thought. So that weekend, the three of us went together. I drove to my coworker's house first, and then we picked up the third guy on the way. The drive was easy. Conversation flowed naturally. We talked about golf, about work, about nothing in particular. There was no tension, no strange energy in the car. It felt like any other casual outing with people you know reasonably well. When we arrived at the Expo Mart, the place was busy and loud. Booths everywhere. People milling around with bags full of brochures and freebies. The energy was upbeat, the kind of environment designed to distract and entertain. We wandered from stand to stand, checking out clubs, gadgets, training aids, and apparel. Some of it was interesting, some of it was ridiculous, and we laughed about that. At several booths, there were contests and raffles for trips, equipment, and experiences. We filled out entry forms almost jokingly, making comments about which of us would end up winning some luxury golf getaway. It was lighthearted and silly, the kind of banter that feels good precisely because it doesn't matter. Nothing about the day stood out as meaningful at the time. After we were done at the show, we decided to go out for dinner. We picked a place nearby, ordered food, had a few beers, and kept talking. Golf came up again, of course, but so did work, sports, random stories, and jokes that probably wouldn't be funny outside that moment. The conversation was relaxed. There were laughs. There were pauses filled comfortably rather than awkwardly. He seemed completely normal. If anything, he seemed engaged and present. He didn't withdraw or go quiet. He didn't hint at anything being wrong. There were no heavy statements, no emotional confessions, no moments that made you think, in hindsight, that this was some kind of goodbye. He was just another guy enjoying a night out. When the evening wound down, we dropped him off at his house. He thanked us, said goodbye, and went inside. It was casual and uneventful. Then my coworker drove me back to his place, and I headed home. That was it. At the time, that day didn't feel significant. It blended into the category of nice weekend outings that fade quickly in your memory. If nothing had happened afterward, I probably wouldn't remember it at all beyond a vague sense that it had been a pleasant day. But the next morning changed everything. Around 7 in the morning, he went into his garage. He tied a rope to the garage door track and took his own life. That's how I found out. There was no note, at least none that I ever heard about. No explanation that could make sense of what he had done. No message to his wife. No signal that something was about to happen. Less than 12 hours earlier, we had been laughing, eating dinner, and joking about golf prizes we'd never win. The news hit hard, not in a dramatic way, but in a hollow one. It didn't feel real at first. It felt like some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. You want there to be an error, a mix-up, something that will be corrected once more information comes out. But there was no correction. It was true. And suddenly, the ordinary day we had all shared was no longer ordinary at all. What made it especially unsettling wasn't just the act itself. It was the contrast. The way everything had felt so normal. Once you know how something ends, your mind automatically rewinds and replays every detail, searching for clues that weren't obvious at the time. You start questioning moments that once felt insignificant. A look, a tone of voice, a pause in conversation. You wonder if something was hidden in plain sight, if there was some sign you missed. But the truth is, there wasn't anything obvious to miss. That realization is uncomfortable in a way that lingers. It forces you to confront how little you can truly know about what someone else is carrying, even when you spend an entire day with them, even when you laugh with them, eat with them, and talk about plans that imply a future. In the days that followed, work felt strange. The bank still ran the same way. Customers came in, phones rang, emails were sent. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath, there was a quiet shift. People spoke in lower voices. Conversations felt more careful. There was a shared sense of shock that didn't need to be explained out loud. His wife was devastated. Seeing someone grieve in that way leaves its own kind of mark. There's no script for how to respond. Nothing you can say feels adequate. You become acutely aware of the limits of language, of how small words are in the face of that kind of loss. People speculated, quietly and uncomfortably, as people often do when faced with something they don't understand. Some wondered if there had been financial stress. Others talked about depression, about how it can hide behind a smile and a sense of normalcy. But speculation never brings clarity. It just fills silence with noise. What stayed with me most was the realization that the day before his death had been, by all appearances, a good day. Not a tense one. Not a sad one. A good one. That detail challenges the way people often imagine despair. There's an expectation that someone who is about to end their life will look visibly broken, withdrawn, or deeply unhappy. But reality doesn't always match that narrative. Sometimes people are capable of compartmentalizing their pain so completely that it doesn't leak out in obvious ways. That thought is deeply unsettling. It means that you can sit next to someone, joke with them, and never know how close they are to a decision that will end everything. It means that human suffering can be invisible even in moments of connection. I still think about that day sometimes, about how close we were to him, how casually we interacted, how nothing felt off. The memory has a strange quality now. It's both vivid and distorted, colored by what came afterward. The laughter feels different in hindsight. The normality feels almost eerie. It's not the method that haunts me. It's not the headlines or the details people tend to focus on when they talk about these things. It's the quiet realization that someone can seem completely fine, even content, right before they decide not to be here anymore. That idea changes the way you look at people. It makes you more cautious about assumptions, more aware that what you see on the surface is only a small part of someone's reality. It makes you wonder how many others are carrying something heavy without letting it show. It also brings a kind of helplessness. Even if you want to help, even if you care, you can't help with what you don't see. You can't respond to signals that aren't there, and that truth is difficult to accept. Over time, the shock softened, but it never fully went away. The story didn't become less disturbing with distance. If anything, it became more reflective, less about the event itself and more about what it revealed. It revealed how fragile certainty is, how easily we believe that if something were wrong, we would know, that there would be signs, warnings, red flags. That belief is comforting, but it isn't always true. Sometimes people keep their pain hidden until the very end. Whenever I think back on that weekend now, it's not the golf show or the dinner that comes to mind first. It's the moment I learned what happened the next morning, the way everything before it suddenly felt different, the way an ordinary memory became something else entirely. It taught me that some of the most unsettling stories aren't loud or dramatic. They don't announce themselves with chaos. They arrive quietly, wrapped in normalcy, and only reveal their weight after it's too late. And that understanding, once you have it, doesn't really go away. When I was in middle school, we had a mandatory swimming class as part of PE. It was one of those things everyone complained about, but didn't really question. You just showed up, changed, swam your laps, and went back to class smelling like chlorine for the rest of the day. It was uncomfortable, awkward, and mildly embarrassing. But it was treated as normal, just another requirement you had to get through. At that age, you don't really challenge things. You assume adults know what they're doing. You assume rules exist for a reason. You assume that if something is happening in a school setting, especially with teachers around, then it must be safe and appropriate. That assumption is powerful, and it's something most kids rely on without even realizing it. One day, when our class walked into the pool area, something immediately felt off. Right there at the edge of the pool was a video camera on a tripod. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't tucked into a corner or mounted high on a wall like security cameras usually are. It was positioned openly, pointed directly at the water, set up in a way that made it clear it was meant to record the entire pool. I remember slowing down as I walked in, trying to make sense of it. I looked at the other kids to see if anyone else noticed. Some of them did. There were glances, raised eyebrows, quiet looks of confusion. But no one said anything out loud. When you're that age, you often take cues from the adults in the room. If they act like everything is normal, you convince yourself it must be. The day before, our teacher had told us to bring baggy shirts and pants. He explained that we were going to practice swimming in heavy clothing to simulate what it would be like if we ever fell into water in real life while fully dressed. He talked about safety, about how clothes get heavy when wet, about how people panic and drown because they don't know how to move properly. At the time, that explanation made sense. It sounded practical, responsible even. Adults talk a lot about preparedness and real-world scenarios, and this felt like it fit into that category. None of us questioned it too deeply. We were kids. We trusted the explanation because we were taught to, so we did what we were told. We put on oversized clothes over our bathing suits and got into the pool. Swimming like that was much harder than usual. The clothes soaked up water instantly. They dragged you down, clung to your arms and legs, and made even simple movements feel exhausting. Every kick and stroke required more effort. Some kids struggled, some laughed nervously, some looked genuinely uncomfortable. The teacher stood nearby with the camera recording the entire class. He moved slightly from time to time, adjusting the angle, making sure the pool was fully in frame. The camera stayed trained on us as we swam back and forth, heavy and awkward in our wet clothes. The red recording light was on the entire time. After the exercise, while we were still dripping wet and tired, he instructed us to take the clothes off at the side of the pool. We were still wearing our swimsuits underneath, but everything was soaked. The fabric clung to our bodies in an uncomfortable way. It was one of those moments where you feel exposed, even though, technically, nothing inappropriate is happening. The camera kept rolling. A few of us asked why he was recording. Not aggressively, just curious, confused, trying to understand. He answered casually, like the question itself was unnecessary. He said he did this every year. He said that when we were seniors in high school, he would send us the video so we could watch it together and laugh about it. He framed it like a tradition, like something fun and harmless, like a memory we'd all look back on someday and joke about. Even then, something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a quiet discomfort that I couldn't put into words. The explanation didn't fully make sense, but I didn't know enough to challenge it. I just felt that something was off. I grew up in a relatively small town. There was only one high school. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. Stories traveled fast. If something like that had actually happened every year, if seniors were gathering to watch videos of themselves swimming in wet clothes, people would have talked about it. Someone would have mentioned it. But no one ever had. My older sister had gone through the same swimming class. She was 4 years ahead of me and had already graduated by then. She had never mentioned any video. She never talked about some tradition where seniors laughed at old pool footage. Later, when I asked her about it, she looked genuinely confused. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She had never received any video. Neither had her friends. As far as she knew, nothing like that had ever happened. That should have been a red flag, but at the time, I didn't fully understand why it bothered me. I didn't have the language or the confidence to push further. I was a kid. He was a teacher. Teachers were authority figures. They controlled grades, discipline, and the flow of the class. Questioning them didn't feel safe or productive, so I pushed the thought aside. Middle school moved on the way it always does. New classes, new teachers, new things to worry about. The swimming class faded into the background of memory, filed away with other uncomfortable but forgettable experiences. Eventually, I transferred to a different school. I made new friends. My life changed. That chapter closed. Years passed. Then one day, long after middle school had stopped feeling relevant to my daily life, I was scrolling through Facebook. An article popped up in my feed shared by someone from my hometown. The headline stopped me cold. The name was immediately familiar. It was my old swimming teacher. I clicked on the article without really thinking about it. At first, my brain refused to connect the dots. I read the words slowly, feeling a growing sense of unease with every sentence. The article explained that there had been an investigation. Authorities had searched his computer. What they found wasn't small or questionable. It wasn't something that could be brushed off or misunderstood. They found a massive amount of child sexual abuse material stored on his hard drive. Not a few files, not something accidental, an enormous collection. Enough that there was no doubt about what he had been doing. He was arrested. He went to prison. As I sat there staring at my screen, that memory from middle school rushed back with a clarity so sharp it made my stomach turn. The pool, the tripod, the camera pointed straight at us, the explanation that never made sense, the promise that had never been fulfilled. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Those recordings were never meant for us. That realization hit harder than the article itself. It reframed something I had once accepted as uncomfortable but harmless into something deeply disturbing. The idea that something so wrong had happened in plain sight, justified with a calm voice and a lesson plan, made my skin crawl. I thought about how normal it all felt at the time, how easily it was explained away with words like safety and preparation, how quickly kids will accept an explanation when it comes from someone in authority, how little it takes to cross a line when no one is taught how to recognize it. I thought about how many years he had been teaching, how many classes had stood in front of that camera, how many kids had trusted that what was happening was okay because an adult said it was. Nothing overt happened to me. There was no moment where someone touched me or said something explicitly inappropriate. There's no single memory that screams danger on its own. But that doesn't mean nothing was wrong. Looking back, the unease was there for a reason. The explanation never added up. The tradition never existed. The recordings never went where he claimed they would. It's unsettling to realize that your instincts were right before your brain had the evidence to prove it. It's even more unsettling to realize how easily those instincts can be overridden when you're young and conditioned to obey. Every once in a while, that memory resurfaces. Not always as a clear image, but as a feeling, a cold, creeping awareness. The kind that settles in your chest and makes you uncomfortable without immediately explaining why. It's the realization that something you once accepted as normal wasn't normal at all. That someone you were told to trust was quietly doing something monstrous right in front of you. It also makes you think about all the times kids feel uncomfortable, but don't know how to express it. Or do express it, only to be dismissed. Or convince themselves they're overreacting because no one else seems bothered. That's the part that sticks with me. Not just what he did, but how easily it fit into the structure of a school day. How it hid behind rules, schedules, and authority. How it relied on silence, compliance, and trust. Even now, years later, it still gives me the heebie-jeebies, not because of fear in the traditional sense, but because of the realization that danger doesn't always look dangerous at the time. Sometimes it looks like routine. Sometimes it sounds like a reasonable explanation. Sometimes it feels wrong, but you don't yet have permission to trust that feeling. I do now. And that memory, uncomfortable as it is, made sure of that. It's not something I'll ever fully forget. And honestly, I don't think I should. Since 2007, something deeply unsettling has been happening along the shores of the Pacific Northwest, particularly around the Seattle area in the United States and the Vancouver region in Canada. It's not something dramatic in the way crimes usually are. There's no single event you can point to, no clear beginning or end. Instead, it's been happening slowly, quietly, in a way that almost feels accidental. And yet, once you know about it, it's hard not to think about it every time the subject comes up. Severed human feet have been washing up on shore. Not once, not twice, but again and again. As of now, 24 separate human feet have been discovered along beaches and coastlines in this region. They've turned up in places where people go to relax. Sandy beaches, rocky shores, walking paths along the water. Now, sometimes they're caught in seaweed. Sometimes they're just there in plain sight, where someone might be out walking their dog or taking their kids for a day near the ocean. About half of these feet have been identified. Through DNA and forensic work, authorities have been able to link them to people who were previously reported missing. People who vanished years earlier, sometimes under tragic or mysterious circumstances. The remaining feet are still unidentified. No names, no families notified. Just fragments of people whose stories may never be fully known. What makes the situation even more disturbing is that in all but one case, investigators have not been able to determine a cause of death. Even more strangely, there has been no evidence of foul play. No knife marks, no saw marks, no signs that the feet were deliberately cut off, and no consistent injuries that suggest violence. No pattern that points to a serial killer or organized crime. Just feet, over and over again. When the first few were found, fear spread quickly. People naturally jumped to the worst conclusions. The idea that dismembered body parts were appearing along the coast triggered something primal. Many wondered if there was a killer dumping bodies into the water. Others imagined something ritualistic or intentional. The randomness made it worse. The fact that the discoveries kept happening without a clear explanation created a kind of background dread that lingered in the public consciousness. Eventually, investigators and forensic experts began to piece together an explanation that is now considered the most likely one. When a body decomposes underwater, especially in cold, moving ocean water, joints can naturally separate over time. The ankle joint is particularly vulnerable. It's a point where bones, ligaments, and soft tissue can break down more easily during long periods of submersion. On top of that, many people wear sneakers, and modern sneakers are often buoyant because of the materials they're made from. As the rest of the body sinks, breaks apart, or is consumed by marine life, the foot can detach while still inside the shoe. Because the shoe floats, the foot rises to the surface. From there, tides and currents can carry it long distances. Weeks, months, even years later, it can wash ashore far from where the person originally entered the water. On paper, the explanation makes sense. It's supported by forensic science. It aligns with what is known about decomposition in marine environments. It explains why the feet are often found still inside shoes. It explains why there are no tool marks or signs of intentional removal. It explains why remains can surface long after someone goes missing. And yet, even with all of that, the story still feels deeply unsettling. Part of that is because this phenomenon is almost entirely unique to this region. People drown and go missing in oceans, lakes, and rivers all over the world. Bodies decompose underwater everywhere. Sneakers float everywhere. But nowhere else has experienced this steady, long-term pattern of severed feet washing ashore with this kind of frequency. That's the part no one has been able to fully explain. Why here? Why the waters of the Salish Sea and the surrounding coastlines? Why this specific combination of geography, ocean currents, water temperature, population density, and human activity seems to produce this outcome again and again? Scientists can point to contributing factors, but there's no single, definitive answer that explains why this doesn't happen elsewhere in the same way. Then there's the human side of it, which is easy to lose when the story is reduced to statistics and theories. Each foot belonged to a person, a real person who lived a life, someone who had family, friends, habits, plans, fears, and hopes. Someone who went missing and left people behind wondering what happened to them. In the cases where identities were confirmed, families were finally given some form of answer, but it was a brutal one. Finding out that your loved one is dead without knowing how they died, why they died, or what they went through doesn't bring closure. It confirms loss, but it doesn't resolve it. It turns hope into grief without offering understanding. And for the unidentified feet, there's an even colder feeling. Somewhere, there may be families who are still waiting, still checking phones, still holding on to the idea that their missing person might come back someday. They may not know that the only part of their loved one to ever resurface was a single foot in a sneaker carried quietly to shore by the ocean. What makes the story linger in people's minds is how impersonal it all feels. There's no villain, no crime to solve, no one to arrest, no final revelation that makes sense of everything. It's just nature doing what nature does, breaking bodies down and redistributing them in ways that clash violently with our need for order and meaning. It's unsettling because it reminds us that the world doesn't arrange itself into clean narratives. Things don't always happen for reasons we can understand. Sometimes there's no intent, no lesson, no explanation that makes it feel okay. It's also disturbing because of how ordinary the discoveries often are. These feet aren't found during dramatic recovery missions or deep-sea searches. They're found by regular people. Someone walking along the beach, someone out for a jog, someone enjoying a quiet day by the water. One moment you're appreciating the scenery. The next you're staring at a sneaker with something inside it that shouldn't be there, even knowing the science doesn't fully take the edge off. There's something about the repetition, the randomness, the way it keeps happening quietly, in the background of everyday life. Years pass. People forget. Then another foot appears, and the story resurfaces again, just as unsettling as before. It forces you to confront how indifferent the ocean really is. It doesn't care about our need for explanations. It doesn't care about our sense of dignity or completeness. It moves what it moves. It reveals what it reveals, and it keeps the rest hidden. To this day, no one can say with absolute certainty that every single case fits the same explanation. No one can say there isn't an outlier or a factor we haven't considered yet. And even if the science is correct across the board, it doesn't make the image any easier to live with. A shoreline, a shoe, a foot, and the knowledge that somewhere beneath the surface, the rest of the story is still lost to the water, carried by currents that don't explain themselves and never will. I was 17, just weeks away from leaving for boot camp, and everything in my life felt loud, fast, and unfinished. That strange space before you leave home for something big messes with your head. You feel invincible and terrified at the same time. Every night feels like it might be the last normal one. Every bad idea feels justified because in your mind, you're about to disappear into a different version of yourself anyway. That's how I ended up at that party. It was out in the woods, the kind of place teenagers pick specifically because it's far from houses and streetlights. Someone's older cousin had found the spot years earlier, and it had become a regular thing. Dirt paths, trees packed close together, the smell of damp leaves and smoke hanging in the air. Cars were parked haphazardly along the edge of the woods. People clustered around cheap speakers and coolers, passing bottles and laughing too loud. I was there with a close friend of mine. We were drinking heavily, way more than we should have been. I remember feeling loose, reckless, buzzing with that sloppy confidence that only comes from being young and drunk and convinced Nothing truly bad can happen to you. The night felt like it was spinning, but in a good way, like everything was unreal and temporary. At some point, the alcohol caught up with me. I wandered away from the main group, weaving between trees, trying to find a spot where I could throw up without an audience. I bent over, hands on my knees, retching into the dirt. My head was pounding. My mouth tasted like bile. And I remember thinking that this was going to be a rough morning. Then I looked up. Through the trees, cutting through the darkness, I saw red and blue lights flashing. Not faint, not distant. Close enough that they lit up the trunks of the trees in pulses. Police lights. The alcohol haze vanished instantly. That cold shock of fear snapped me sober in a way nothing else ever has. My heart slammed into my ribs. I didn't stop to think or double-check. I just knew what that meant. Cops were outside the woods, and if they were already there, it was only a matter of time before they came in. I ran. I sprinted back toward the party, stumbling over roots, pushing through branches, adrenaline flooding my system. When I reached the group, I was shouting before I even fully stopped. Cops. Multiple cops. Outside the woods. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. People grabbed bags, bottles were dropped, someone knocked over a speaker. It was like flipping a switch. Everyone scattered in different directions, instinctively trying to disappear into the trees. I took off down one of the dirt paths that cut deeper into the woods. My lungs burned, my legs felt heavy, and my vision tunneled as I ran. I could hear other people crashing through brush nearby, branches snapping, someone yelling in the distance. Then I saw him. At the far end of the path, maybe 30 or 40 feet ahead, there was a grown man. Not someone from the party, not a teenager. He was standing still, his body angled slightly away from me, his head turned over his shoulder, like he was listening for something behind him. Everything in me screamed that this was wrong. He didn't move like a drunk kid. He wasn't stumbling or panicking. He looked tense, alert, focused. And in that split second, my brain made a decision without consulting me. I dove. I threw myself sideways off the path into the bushes, not caring where I landed. I rolled under low branches, scraping my arms and face, dirt filling my mouth. I flattened myself against the ground, pulling leaves and branches over me as best I could. I didn't breathe. The man started walking down the path. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching softly against the dirt. Each step sounded impossibly loud in my ears. I could see his legs through the gaps in the branches as he got closer. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. He stopped. He stopped as close to me as he could be while still standing on the path. I was looking up at him through the branches, frozen. It was extremely dark, and I couldn't see his face clearly. Just the outline of his body against the faint light filtering through the trees. I remember the smell of damp earth, the sharp scent of leaves crushed under my weight, the way my muscles were screaming at me not to move. He stood there for a few seconds that felt like minutes. He looked around. I don't know what he was looking for. I don't know if he heard me dive into the bushes or if he was just checking his surroundings. I remember thinking that if he stepped off the path even a little, if he kicked the bushes or shined a light, he would find me instantly. But he didn't. After scanning the area, he turned and walked away, continuing down the path and disappearing into the darkness. I stayed where I was long after he was gone. I didn't move. I didn't breathe normally. I waited until my heartbeat slowed enough that I felt like I could function again. Only then did I carefully crawl out from under the bushes, my clothes torn and dirty, my hands shaking. I eventually found a few other people from the party. We were scattered, hiding in different spots, whispering to each other, trying to figure out how to get out without being seen. The woods felt different now, hostile. Every sound made me flinch. After what felt like forever, we managed to sneak out of the area, staying low, moving slowly, avoiding the main paths. My friend and I stuck together and walked back to his place, taking back roads and cutting through neighborhoods to avoid police. There was a lot of cop activity everywhere. Squad cars parked along streets, lights flashing in the distance, officers talking in clusters. It didn't look like a simple party bust anymore. It looked serious. We crashed at his house, exhausted, adrenaline finally wearing off. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man standing at the end of the path, looking back over his shoulder. The next morning, we were sitting at the breakfast table, trying to act normal, when his mom casually mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She said that all the cops in our town and the neighboring town had been out all night on a manhunt. She explained that a guy had robbed a convenience store, shot and killed the clerk, then beaten a woman badly and carjacked her. He had dumped the car and disappeared into the woods, the same woods we had been partying in. The room went quiet. I felt cold all over as the pieces slammed together in my head. The police lights, the urgency, the man in the woods who didn't belong there, the way he moved, the way he stopped so close to me. A few days later, the police released a photo when they finally caught him. It was the same man. There was no doubt. Same build, same face, same eyes I had barely seen through the darkness, but somehow recognized instantly. The realization hit me harder than anything else had. At the time, I laughed about it. That's what you do when you're young and scared and don't know how to process something like that. I told the story like it was a wild, close call, something crazy that happened before I left for the military. People reacted with shock, with disbelief, with nervous laughter. But as I got older, the humor drained out of it. I started thinking about how close that moment really was, about how I was drunk, disoriented, alone in the woods, about how easily he could have stepped off the path, about how if I had hesitated for even a second before diving into the bushes, he would have seen me. I think about what kind of person calmly walks through the woods after killing someone. About what he might have done if he'd found me hiding there, vulnerable and trapped. About how luck, pure dumb luck, was the only thing that separated me from becoming part of that story. It doesn't feel funny anymore. It feels like a thin line I crossed without realizing it at the time. One bad decision layered on top of another, saved only by timing and chance. I still remember the sound of his footsteps, the way my body locked up in fear, the absolute certainty that if he noticed me, nothing good would come of it. I went to boot camp not long after that. Life moved on. But that night never fully left me. It was the moment I learned how close danger can get without announcing itself. How it can brush past you in the dark while you're too young and stupid to understand what you just avoided. And how sometimes you don't realize how bad it could have been until years later, when you finally have the distance and maturity to see it clearly. That's what really stays with me. Not the party, not the cops, not even the arrest photo. Just the knowledge that I was lying in the dirt, inches away from someone who had already proven he was capable of killing. And the only reason I'm here to tell this story is because he didn't take one more step. My sister and I were staying at my grandparents' house. We were both pretty young at the time, but she was younger than me, and right in that phase where she thought she knew everything and everyone else was overreacting. She had recently become boy crazy in the worst possible way. The kind of crush every adult immediately sees as bad news. She'd already been pushing boundaries, sneaking phone calls, acting secretive, testing how much she could get away with. That night, though, none of us had any idea just how far she was planning to take it. The house itself was old and familiar, the kind of place that always felt safe simply because it had been part of the family for so long. The floors creaked, the doors were heavy, and at night it had that deep, settled quiet you only get in houses that have been standing for decades. We went to bed like any other night, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. I was fast asleep when it happened. All at once, the smoke detector started going off. Not just one alarm chirping because of a low battery. Every single smoke detector in the house erupted at the same time. The sound was sharp and frantic, echoing down the hallway and through the rooms, bouncing off the walls. It was the exact sound you'd expect if the house were on fire. I shot upright in bed instantly, my heart pounding, adrenaline hitting me so hard it felt like I'd been dropped into cold water. I threw my bedroom door open, fully expecting to see smoke pouring through the hall or flames licking at the walls. There was nothing. No smoke, no smell, no haze. The hallway looked exactly the same as it always did, except for the deafening alarms screaming overhead. That almost made it worse. My brain couldn't line up what my ears were telling me with what my eyes were seeing. I ran down the hall, checking rooms, checking corners, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. I checked the kitchen. Nothing. The living room. Nothing. Then I went to my sister's room. Her bed was empty. The covers were pulled back, but she wasn't there. That's when the fear really hit. This wasn't just confusion anymore. This was panic. I didn't stop to think or try to reason it out. I ran straight to my grandma's room. She was already awake, sitting up in bed, just as startled and confused as I was, the alarms still blaring through the house. I told her, probably too fast and too loud, that my sister wasn't in her room, that she wasn't anywhere I could find. No, we didn't hesitate. We started searching immediately. We called her name, checked every room, checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. We checked doors, we checked windows. The smoke detectors kept screaming the entire time, relentless and impossible to ignore. It felt like the house itself was shouting that something was very wrong. Those 10 minutes felt endless. Then the front door cracked open. My sister slipped inside, trying and failing to be quiet, clearly thinking she'd get away with it. She froze the second she saw us standing there, wide awake, staring straight at her. The look on her face said everything. She knew she was caught. Before my grandma or I could even open our mouths to yell, something happened that still sends chills through me when I think about it. The smoke detectors stopped. All of them. At the exact same time. 1 second, the house was filled with that piercing alarm, and the next second, there was complete silence. No gradual fade. No single detector lagging behind the others. Just instant, absolute quiet. Like someone had flipped a switch. There was still no smoke, no fire, no explanation. My sister, of course, got punished. There was no talking her way out of that one. She was shaken, grounded, and sent back to her room. Eventually, the house settled again, the way it always did at night. But neither my grandma nor I slept after that. Later, we sat together and talked about it. We replayed everything, step by step, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when my grandma said something that made my chest tighten. She reminded me that my mom had always been obsessive about fire safety. Not casually cautious, but deeply serious about it. When my mom was young, her childhood best friend had lost their home in a fire. It had left a permanent mark on her. Because of that, my mom became known in the family as the firefighter. She always knew where the fire extinguisher was. She constantly checked smoke detector batteries. She drilled escape routes into us until we could recite them without thinking. She made sure we knew exactly how to get out of the house if there was ever a fire. Even now, years later, I can still picture those routes clearly. My grandma said very quietly that if there was one thing my mom would never ignore, it was a fire alarm. And that's when the thought hit me. What if that was her? I don't know how it would work. I don't know what mechanism could possibly explain it. I don't know why every alarm went off at once or why they all stopped the moment my sister was safely back inside. There had never been a malfunction like that before, and there was never one after. Just that night, just that moment. I'm not saying I have proof. I'm not saying I understand it. All I know is that something woke me up. Something woke my grandma up. And something stopped my sister from disappearing into the night without anyone knowing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was some bizarre electrical failure that lined up perfectly with everything else. But deep down, neither my grandma nor I really believed that. If my mom could reach us in any way, if she could still watch over us, that's exactly how she would do it. Loud, impossible to ignore, focused entirely on safety, focused on protecting her kids. I don't have a better explanation. All I know is that she was there that night. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.